Moonlight District. Chapter 1. The first time I saw magic, I was working the night shift at Lou's Gas & Go on 43rd and Harrison. It was 2:17 a.m., according to the ancient analog clock above the register, the one Lou refused to replace despite it being perpetually 3 minutes slow. I was halfway through my dog-eared paperback when the bell above the door jingled. I didn't look up immediately. Late-night customers fell into predictable categories: truckers needing caffeine, drunk college kids hunting for nachos, or the occasional insomniac browsing aimlessly. I'd learned to gauge their needs without making eye contact, a skill that made the midnight to 8 shift marginally more bearable. "You sell salt?" The voice was feminine but rough, like velvet dragged across concrete. I glanced up and nearly dropped my book. She stood just inside the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the flickering fluorescence of the parking lot. Rain had plastered her dark hair to her face, and a gash across her left cheek glistened wetly. It wasn't her injuries that startled me, though. It was the faint blue luminescence that seemed to pulse beneath her skin, like veins filled with liquid moonlight. "Salt," she repeated more urgently. "Table salt, sea salt, kosher salt, anything." I pointed to aisle 3, and she moved with surprising grace for someone who looked like they'd just lost a fight. "We've got Morton's," I offered lamely. She disappeared between the shelves. I heard several items clatter to the floor before she returned with 3 blue containers of salt clutched against her chest. "Will that be all?" I asked, falling back on the script of retail normalcy. She slapped a 20 on the counter. "Keep the change if you'll let me use your microwave." Before I could answer, she was already behind the counter, emptying the salt into the ancient microwave we kept for customer use. I should have stopped her. Lou had strict policies about customers behind the counter, but something in her eyes made the words die in my throat. "Look away," she commanded, pressing start on the microwave. I didn't. That was my first mistake. The salt began to glow, softly at first, then with increasing intensity until the microwave's interior blazed with blue-white light. The woman withdrew a small object from her pocket, a shard of what looked like obsidian, and held it up to the microwave door. She was chanting something under her breath, words that seemed to slide off my consciousness like water off wax. The microwave timer reached 0. No ding followed. The bell had broken years ago, but the light inside didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to pour out, coalescing around the black shard. For a brief moment, symbols appeared in the air between the woman and the microwave, glowing sigils that burned themselves into my retinas. Then everything went dark. The overhead lights, the cooler hum, the neon open sign, all dead. The only illumination came from the woman's hand, where the obsidian shard now pulsed with contained blue fire. "Shit," she said, looking at me with genuine regret. "You really should have looked away." That was the night my ordinary life ended, and my education in the hidden world began. My name is Eli Marsh, and this is the story of how I learned that reality has seams, and what happens to people who fall through them. The woman's name was Nessa Voigt, and she blew out the power grid for 6 blocks. "Condensers," she explained 2 hours later, as we sat in an all-night diner 15 blocks from Lou's. "They're sensitive to thaumaturgic discharge." I stared blankly at her over my untouched coffee. The blue glow beneath her skin had faded to almost nothing, but occasionally I caught flickers of it when she gestured. The cut on her face had mysteriously stopped bleeding. "Magical energy," she clarified, mistaking my silence for confusion rather than shock. "It doesn't play nice with electronics, especially not when you're doing emergency, warding on the fly." "Magic," I repeated, testing the word. It felt both ridiculous and strangely inadequate for what I'd witnessed. She sighed and pushed her empty plate aside. "Look, I didn't mean to drag you into this. You were supposed to look away. So this is my fault?" "No." She ran a hand through her still damp hair. "It's the fault of whatever's been hunting me for the last 3 days. But now you've seen too much, and that makes you vulnerable." "Vulnerable to what?" She didn't answer immediately, scanning the nearly empty diner instead. Only the cook and a waitress remained, both pointedly ignoring us. Finally, she leaned forward. "There are spaces between what most people think of as reality," she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Pockets, folds, hidden districts that exist alongside the world, you know. Some are almost identical to here, just different enough that the rules don't quite match up. Others are so alien they'd drive you mad if you stayed too long." I should have laughed. Should have written her off as delusional, paid for my coffee, and gone home to my crappy studio apartment to sleep off this bizarre encounter. Instead, I found myself asking, "And you're from one of these places?" "No." I'm as human as you are. A slight twist of her mouth suggested this wasn't entirely accurate. But I work as a courier between them, and something followed me back from my last delivery. Something dangerous? Something that shouldn't be here. She glanced at the obsidian shard, now wrapped in a napkin beside her coffee cup. Something that wants this. What is it? A key. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, to a door that needs to stay locked. I took a long sip of my now cold coffee, trying to process. And you? What? Used table salt and a convenience store microwave too. Warded off. For the first time, she smiled, a quick, genuine expression that transformed her face. Improvisation is about 70% of practical magic. Salt's a universal conductor for binding energy. The microwave provided the electromagnetic field I needed to charge the rune sequence. She tapped her temple. The rest was up here. So why tell me all this? Why not just leave me in the dark, literally, back at Luz? Her smile faded. Because you saw active magic unfold. It leaves a trace on you, like a scent marker. If the thing hunting me catches your trail, it'll assume you're working with me. An uncomfortable chill settled in my stomach. And am I working with you? She studied me for a long moment. That depends on how attached you are to your current life. What's that supposed to mean? It means that once certain doors are opened, they're hard to close. You've glimpsed something most people spend their entire lives never knowing exists. You can try to forget it, convince yourself it was a trick of light or a hallucination. Many do. She shrugged. But in my experience, once people know there's more to the world, they can never go back to not knowing. I thought about my life, the dead-end night job, the community college classes I kept dropping, the string of relationships that never quite took. There wasn't much to be attached to. And if I don't want to forget? Nessa Voigt smiled again, but this time there was something sad in it. Then I hope you're a fast learner, because lesson 2 is about to begin. She nodded toward the diner's front window. Outside, a figure stood motionless beneath a streetlight. From this distance, it looked like an ordinary person, tall, wearing what might have been a long coat. But as I watched, it tilted its head at an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees to the side, and I realized I couldn't make out its face. Where features should have been was just absence, as if that part of reality hadn't fully rendered. What is that? I whispered. A seeker, said Nessa, already standing and throwing bills on the table. And our cue to leave. Back door. Now. Chapter 2. We ran through the pre-dawn streets, the city strangely empty even for 4:30 a.m. Looking back, I realized that emptiness wasn't coincidence. The seeker had cleared our path, folding away anyone who might witness what was coming. Don't look back, Nessa panted as we cut through an alley between apartment buildings. They can lock onto eye contact. I kept my gaze forward, focusing on her back as she navigated a maze of service entrances and narrow passages I'd never noticed despite living in Grayton my entire life. We emerged onto Wicker Avenue, an upscale shopping district that should have been miles from the diner. How did we? Urban shortcuts, she interrupted, barely slowing. Cities have pressure points. Know the right ones, and distance becomes negotiable. She pulled me into a recessed doorway belonging to an expensive-looking boutique. Above the door hung a small wooden sign depicting a silver needle crossed with a golden thread. There was no name, just the symbol. Nessa pressed her palm against the door's lock plate. Instead of the electronic buzz I expected, a soft chime sounded from within. Come on, she muttered. After what seemed an eternity, the door cracked open to reveal a sliver of a face. An elderly Asian woman with shrewd eyes and hair pulled into a severe bun. We're closed, the woman said flatly. Hello to you too, Madam Min. Nessa's tone was respectful but urgent. We need sanctuary. The woman's gaze flickered over me dismissively. You know the rules. No tagalongs. He's been marked. Seeker on our trail. That changed something. The woman's eyes widened slightly before narrowing again. What have you brought to my doorstep, courier? Nothing I can't handle with your help. Nessa withdrew the obsidian shard, still wrapped in its diner napkin. Plus I'll owe you. Madam Min's mouth pursed as if she'd tasted something sour, but she stepped back, opening the door wider. Debts to me are not trivial matters. Neither is what's coming, Nessa replied, pushing me through the doorway ahead of her. Inside, the shop was a riot of color and texture. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, silks, brocades, materials I couldn't name that seemed to shift hues as I glanced at them. Glass cases displayed intricate embroidery and what looked like antique sewing implements. The air smelled of sandalwood and something sharper, like ozone after lightning. Madam Min locked the door behind us and drew a heavy velvet curtain across it. You have 5 minutes to explain before I decide whether to keep you or put you back outside. Nessa sagged against a cutting table, the adrenaline visibly draining from her. The authority sent me into the deep market 3 days ago. Routine diplomatic pouch to the Collectors Guild. There is nothing routine about dealing with the collectors, Madam Min sniffed, moving behind a counter to put on a kettle. Tell me about it. The guild is renovating their embassy. Apparently, they've acquired some new architecture they're particularly proud of. While I was waiting for their acknowledgement seal, I noticed this. She placed the obsidian shard on the counter. Madam Min didn't touch it, but leaned close, her eyes narrowing. And you took it? From the collectors? It was sitting in their receiving area, in a box of earth artifacts labeled for disposal. So you stole it? Nessa shrugged. Salvaged it. But as soon as I crossed back, something followed. Not a collector. They wouldn't send a seeker. This is something else. While they spoke, I moved deeper into the shop, drawn to a mannequin in the corner draped with what appeared to be an ordinary business suit. On closer inspection, the fabric wasn't cloth at all, but thousands of tiny metallic scales sewn onto a mesh backing. Don't touch that, Madam Min said sharply, without turning around. It's not finished, and the binding is unstable. I snatched my hand back. Sorry, this is all. A lot to process. The boy knows nothing, Madam Min observed, turning her attention back to Nessa. Why bring him? He witnessed active thaumaturgy. The seeker will target him now regardless. So you've sentenced him to death or recruitment. How generous of you. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Death? Nessa shot Madam Min an irritated look. Nobody's dying today. I just need a safe place to examine the artifact and figure out what we're dealing with. Then we can decide next steps. The kettle began to whistle, an oddly normal sound in such a strange environment. Madam Min poured 3 cups of something that smelled nothing like tea. Drink, she ordered, pushing a cup toward me. It will help with the shock. I hesitated, but Nessa nodded encouragingly. The liquid was amber-colored and tasted of cinnamon, honey, and something bitter I couldn't identify. Warmth spread through me immediately, clearing the fog of fear and confusion that had settled over my thoughts. Better? Madam Min asked, watching me intently. I nodded, surprised to find it was true. What is this? Clarity brew. Traditional recipe. She turned back to Nessa. You have 3 more minutes before I decide. Nessa carefully unwrapped the obsidian shard and placed it on a square of black velvet Madam Min provided. In the shop's warm lighting, I could see it wasn't pure obsidian, but had veins of some silvery metal running through it. I think it's a fragment of a larger key, Nessa explained. The energy signature doesn't match anything in the authority's standard catalogue, but it's definitely old. Pre-schism, maybe even first wave. These terms meant nothing to me, but Madam Min inhaled sharply. If that's true, you're involved in matters far beyond your clearance, courier. Hence the seeker. Nessa traced the air above the fragment, her fingertips leaving faint blue trails that lingered for seconds before fading. The question is who sent it. The collectors shouldn't have authority to deploy seekers outside their territory, and the authority would have just recalled me directly. A third party then, Madam Min mused, sipping her brew. Someone who knew what you'd found. A heavy thud against the front door interrupted them. All 3 of us froze. Time's up, whispered Madam Min. She moved with surprising swiftness for her age, sweeping the obsidian fragment into a small metal box that she thrust at Nessa. Backroom. The sigil circle. Go. Nessa grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a beaded curtain at the rear of the shop. Behind it lay a small workroom dominated by a large table covered in swatches of fabric and design sketches. What captured my attention, however, was the floor. A perfect circle about 8 feet in diameter had been inlaid with white marble into the hardwood and etched with symbols similar to what I'd glimpsed during Nessa's microwave ritual. A permanent ward, I guessed. Nessa looked impressed. Quick study. Yes, and a powerful one. Stand in the center. Another thud from the front of the shop, louder this time. The beaded curtain trembled. What about Madam Min? I asked as Nessa positioned me precisely in the middle of the circle. She can handle herself. Nessa joined me, standing so close I could feel her breath. She withdrew the obsidian fragment from the metal box and held it between us. This is going to feel strange. Try not to move. Before I could ask what she meant, she began to speak. Not in English or any language I recognized. The words seemed to have physical weight, pressing against my ears and skin. The symbols etched in the floor began to glow with the same blue-white light I'd seen at the convenience store. A crash from the front room, followed by Madam Min's voice raised in what sounded like command. Nessa's chanting intensified, and the light from the circle rose around us like a cylinder of luminescence. Through it, the workroom became distorted, wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. Another crash, closer now. Something was coming through the beaded curtain. Something tall and wrong, its proportions subtly but horrifyingly incorrect, like a human figure drawn by someone who'd only had humanity described to them. "Nessa," I warned, my voice strangely muffled inside the light cylinder. "I see it. Don't break the circle." She raised the obsidian fragment higher, and it began to pulse in time with her words. The Seeker, it could only be the Seeker, pushed through the beads. Where its face should have been was still that disturbing absence, not darkness but nothingness, a void in reality. It extended an arm that seemed too long for its body, reaching toward the edge of our circle. The moment it touched the boundary of light, several things happened at once. The Seeker emitted a sound like tearing metal. Madam Min appeared behind it, brandishing what looked like an antique pair of shears that glowed red-hot. Nessa shouted a final phrase, and the obsidian fragment shattered in her hand. The floor beneath us vanished, and we were falling, not down but sideways, through a space that hurt my eyes to perceive. Colors I had no names for streaked past. Pressure built in my ears until I was certain they would burst. Then impact, not hard but disorienting, like landing in deep snow. The world reasserted itself around us piece by piece. A floor beneath my feet, air in my lungs, gravity pulling in a direction I could recognize. We were no longer in Madam Min's workroom. We stood in what appeared to be an abandoned subway station, dimly lit by emergency lights that cast more shadows than illumination. The air smelled of dust and electrical ozone. Nessa staggered beside me, catching herself against a tiled wall. Blood dripped from her palm where the obsidian fragment had cut her. "Welcome," she said hoarsely, "to the Moonlight District." Chapter 3. "Don't move," Nessa warned as I took a tentative step toward the subway platform's edge. "The boundaries aren't stable yet." I froze, noticing for the first time the strange shimmer in the air about 10 feet ahead of us. Like heat distortion over asphalt in summer, but vertical and faintly iridescent. "What is that?" "Transition membrane. Give it a minute to settle." I backed up slowly until I stood beside her again. "Where exactly are we? This doesn't look like any subway station in Grayton." "That's because it isn't, and is a station in Grayton." She tore a strip from her already tattered shirt and wrapped it around her bleeding palm. "The Moonlight District exists in the spaces between your world and others. Think of it like a transfer station where different realities overlap." The shimmer ahead was gradually fading, revealing more of the platform. Despite the abandoned appearance, I noticed odd details that suggested this place wasn't entirely neglected. Intricate graffiti covered some walls. Not random tags, but elaborate symbols that seemed to pulse faintly if I looked at them directly. A digital departure board hung askew from one wall, displaying text in a script I couldn't read that periodically flickered and changed. "Is this where you're from?" I asked. "No one's from the district. It's neutral territory, a buffer zone between the authorities' domain and other places." She gestured vaguely. "The Deep Market, the Collectors Guild, the Unseen College, and at least a dozen other factions maintain embassies or trading posts here." "And who runs it?" "That's complicated." Nessa pushed herself away from the wall, testing her weight on both feet. "Officially, it's under authority jurisdiction. In practice, it's mostly self-governing, with representatives from each faction forming a loose council." The shimmer had completely disappeared now. Nessa led the way toward what would have been the exit in a normal subway station. Instead of turnstiles, however, we encountered an unmanned booth containing what looked like an antique ticket-punching machine. Nessa approached it and pressed her injured palm against a worn brass plate on the counter. The machine clicked and whirred, and a small paper ticket emerged from a slot. She handed it to me. "Your visitor's pass. Don't lose it. Without it, the district might decide you don't belong here." I examined the ticket. It was simple cream-colored cardstock with an embossed seal showing the same crescent moon I'd noticed in some of the platform graffiti. No text, no barcode, nothing to indicate its purpose. "What happens if the district decides I don't belong?" She didn't answer directly. "Just keep the ticket on you." We climbed a set of stairs that, in a normal station, would have led to the street. Instead, we emerged into a vast enclosed space that defied architectural logic. It reminded me of old photographs of Victorian train stations. A soaring ceiling of glass and iron, But the sky, visible through the glass, wasn't blue or even night dark, but a shifting aurora of purple and green energies. Below this impossible ceiling spread the Moonlight District proper, a maze of narrow streets and mismatched buildings that seemed cobbled together from a dozen different architectural styles and eras. Gaslights cast pools of blue-white illumination, the source of the district's name, I presumed, between which shadows moved with unsettling purpose. "It's beautiful," I said, surprised by my own reaction. "It can be." Nessa sounded tired. "It can also be deadly if you don't know the rules. Stay close to me, don't stare at anyone or anything for too long, and for God's sake, don't accept gifts or make promises." "Fairy tale rules? Seriously?" She threw me a sharp look. "All stories start somewhere, Eli. The oldest rules often have the deepest roots." We descended another staircase and entered the streets of the district. Up close, the discordant architecture was even more apparent. A sleek glass-fronted building might stand beside what looked like a medieval apothecary, while across the street, a structure of living wood twisted upward, its branches forming windows and doorways. The inhabitants were equally diverse. Most appeared human at first glance, though many displayed subtle differences. Unusual coloration, extra digits, eyes that reflected light like animals. Others were more obviously not human. I glimpsed what appeared to be a 9-foot-tall figure, composed entirely of interlocking geometric shapes, conversing with a perfectly normal-looking businessman in a charcoal suit. Despite Nessa's warning, I found it hard not to stare. "Focus," she murmured, nudging me forward. "We need to get off the main thoroughfare. I know a place we can regroup, but it's a few blocks in." "What about Madam Min? Is she okay?" "Min survived worse than a seeker. She'll be fine, probably billing the authority for damages to her shop as we speak." Nessa's confident tone didn't quite mask her concern. We turned down a narrower street lined with what appeared to be residential buildings. The crowd thinned, though occasionally someone would hurry past, throwing curious glances our way. I noticed Nessa kept her injured hand in her pocket, concealing the makeshift bandage. "You're bleeding authority blood in neutral territory," came a voice from a recessed doorway ahead. "Bold move, courier." A figure stepped into the gaslight's blue glow, a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair and skin so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She wore a tailored suit of deep purple with a high collar that framed a face of striking, almost predatory beauty. Nessa tensed beside me. "Mariel, didn't expect to see you slumming in the district." "Likewise." Mariel's gaze shifted to me, and I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a migraine. And with unregistered company, no less. The authorities' standards must be slipping. "He's under my protection," Nessa said firmly. "Is he now?" Mariel smiled, revealing teeth that were just a fraction too sharp to be human. "How resourceful of you, securing a familiar so quickly. Or is he a witness to that mess you left in the border world?" I opened my mouth to object to being discussed as if I weren't present, but Nessa's warning squeeze on my arm stopped me. "We're just passing through," Nessa said. "No need for official interest." "Oh, but there is." Mariel held out a hand, palm up. A small flame appeared above it, not orange or yellow but deep violet. Within the flame floated what looked like a shard of the obsidian fragment Nessa had shattered. When transition artifacts are used for unauthorized crossings, it becomes very much a matter of official interest. Nessa's face remained impassive, but I felt her posture shift subtly, weight balanced on the balls of her feet. "That piece doesn't belong to you or your employers, Mariel." "Curious. It doesn't appear to belong to you either, yet here we are." The violet flame intensified. "The collectors are quite distressed about missing inventory. Would you know anything about that?" "The collectors classify half the objects in our reality as their inventory," Nessa countered. "Their distress is perpetual and largely self-inflicted." Mariel laughed, a sound like crystal chimes. "Oh, I've missed your particular blend of insolence and ignorance, Nessa. It's refreshing in these diplomatic times." Her expression hardened. "But playtime is over. You've interfered with matters beyond your clearance. Come with me to the embassy, return what remains of the artifact, and perhaps we can sort this out without permanent consequences." The threat hung in the air between them. I glanced from Nessa to Mariel, trying to gauge how real the danger was. Mariel exuded casual power, the confidence of someone unaccustomed to being refused. "And my companion?" Nessa asked. "Will be processed according to protocol for unauthorized transitionalists." Mariel's smile didn't reach her eyes. "His memories of the crossing will be adjusted, of course, but the process has a remarkably high success rate. These days. That didn't sound good. I looked to Nessa, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. We appreciate the invitation, she said to Mariel, but I think we'll take our chances with the district council's jurisdiction. Mariel sighed, closing her hand and extinguishing the purple flame. I did try the civilized approach. She reached into her suit jacket. Please don't make this messy. She never finished the sentence. A deafening crack split the air, and the cobblestones between Mariel and us erupted upward in a shower of stone fragments. Mariel leapt backward with inhuman grace as a voice boomed from behind us. Diplomatic immunity, you bureaucratic vulture. I whirled to find the source of the voice, a stocky figure charging down the street toward us. At first, I thought it was a very small person, but as they drew closer, I realized they weren't human at all. Standing about 4 feet tall, with leathery reddish skin, pointed ears, and a wild tangle of orange-grey beard, the newcomer resembled nothing so much as a garden gnome blown up to improbable size. The beard suggested male, though I was learning not to make assumptions in this place, brandished what looked like an antique blunderbuss in one gnarled hand. The weapon's barrel still smoked from whatever explosive charge had torn up the street. Grix, Nessa breathed, relief evident in her voice. Save the reunion. The gnome-like creature growled as he reached us. Embassy goons 2 blocks back. Move. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and yanked me down a side alley barely wide enough for my shoulders. Nessa followed, throwing a last glance at Mariel, who stood watching with cold fury etched on her perfect features. You can't run forever, courier. Mariel called after us. The artifact will return to its rightful owners, with or without your cooperation. Charming friends you have. I managed as we sprinted after Grix through the twisting backstreets of the Moonlight District. Mariel isn't my friend, Nessa replied grimly. She's Authority Special Division, their equivalent of Black Ops. If she's involved, this is bigger than stolen artifacts. Less talking, more running. Grix barked, leading us around another corner and through what appeared to be a kitchen, much to the consternation of the octopus-like chef wielding multiple knives at once. We burst out the opposite door into yet another alley, this one mercifully empty. Grix skidded to a halt before a nondescript metal door set into a brick wall. No handle, no lock, no markings of any kind. He pressed his palm against the door's surface and muttered something that sounded like profanity in an unknown language. The metal rippled like water, and the door swung inward. Inside, he ordered. Quick, before the tracehounds pick up your scent. I didn't wait to find out what tracehounds were. I ducked through the doorway with Nessa close behind. Grix followed, and the metal door solidified behind him with a sound like a sigh. We stood in a cluttered workshop that smelled of engine oil, spices, and something sulphurous. Workbenches lined the walls, covered in mechanical parts, bottles of colored liquids, and half-assembled devices I couldn't begin to identify. Blueprints and diagrams were tacked haphazardly to every available surface. In the center of the room, a pot bubbled over an open flame, despite the complete absence of ventilation I could see. Welcome to Casa de Grix, our rescuer announced, propping his blunderbuss in a corner. Not pretty, but it's warded 6 ways from Solstice. Even Special Division can't trace you here. I hope you're right, Nessa said, collapsing onto a rickety stool. Thanks for the timely intervention. Don't thank me yet. Grix fixed her with a stern glare from under bushy eyebrows. What in the 17 hells have you stepped in this time, Voight? Half the district's buzzing about a courier gone rogue with a first-wave artifact. I haven't gone rogue, she protested. And I didn't know what it was when I took it. Took it? Grix slapped his forehead. Sweet merciful madness, you actually stole from the collectors? Have you completely lost your mind? It was in their discard pile. The collectors don't discard anything. That's literally their entire purpose. I cleared my throat, drawing their attention. Sorry to interrupt what seems like a fascinating argument, but can someone please explain what's going on? What's this artifact everyone's so worked up about? Why is the scary purple fire lady after us? And, most importantly, how do I get home? Grix turned to me, as if noticing my presence for the first time. He squinted up at me, his leathery face wrinkling further. And who's this lanky border welder? Eli Marsh, Nessa replied. He got caught in the crossfire when a seeker tracked me to his workplace. He's seen active thaumaturgy. So naturally you dragged him to the district. Grix rolled his eyes. Because traumatizing the poor bastard once wasn't enough. I didn't have much choice, Nessa said defensively. The seeker marked him too. Grix grunted, then extended a calloused hand toward me. Grixstoff Ironmaul, Master Artificer and Reluctant Savior of Fools. Call me Grix. I shook his hand, finding it warm and rough like sun-heated sandstone. Nice to meet you. I think. Reserve judgment on that. Grix moved to the bubbling pot and gave it a stir. Might not be so nice when you learn what she's dragged you into. That's what I'm trying to find out, I said pointedly. Nessa sighed, suddenly looking exhausted. It's complicated. Isn't it always? Grix muttered, ladling whatever was in the pot into 3 mismatched mugs. He handed one to each of us. Drink. Restorative brew. You look like you've been through a transition, without proper buffering. The liquid was thick and dark green, with an aroma reminiscent of beef stew and peppermint. My stomach turned, but Nessa took a sip of hers without hesitation, so I reluctantly followed suit. To my surprise, it tasted better than it smelled, earthy and sweet with a lingering warmth that spread from my core to my extremities. Good, Grix nodded approvingly. Now, let's see what all this fuss is about. Nessa reached into her pocket and withdrew several jagged pieces of the obsidian-like material. In Grix's workshop, under the harsh light of what appeared to be modified gas lamps, I could see the silvery veins running through the fragments more clearly. They formed patterns, not random but deliberate, like circuit traces on a computer chip. Grix whistled low. Well, the rumors were true. He produced a jeweler's loupe from amongst the clutter and examined the fragments closely. First wave chronolith. Chapter 3 continued. First wave chronolith, Grix repeated, setting down the loupe with uncharacteristic gentleness. Haven't seen one of these in. Well, longer than you've been alive, courier. What does that mean, first wave? I asked, the restorative brew giving me enough energy to feel curious rather than just overwhelmed. Grix and Nessa exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. History lesson time, Grix said, pulling up a stool opposite mine. How much has she told you about the multiverse situation? Almost nothing, I admitted. Just that there are spaces between realities? Grix snorted. Typical authority training. Keep everything need to know. He took a deep swig from his mug. Listen carefully, border boy, because I'm only explaining this once. He set his mug down with a decisive thud. Reality isn't singular. Never has been. Think of it like a vast ocean with countless currents, each flowing in its own direction. These currents, what we call streams, or sometimes world lines, occasionally cross paths, creating turbulence. Where turbulence is strong enough, you get overlap, places where multiple realities briefly touch. Like the Moonlight District, I guessed. The district is special, Nessa interjected. It's a permanent overlap, artificially stabilized. Getting ahead of me, Grix grumbled. The point is, for most of human history, these overlaps were random, temporary, and largely unnoticed. People who stumbled through them either came back with wild stories no one believed, or didn't come back at all. Then came the first wave, Nessa continued, warming to the explanation. About 200 years ago, a group of scientists and, let's call them mystics for simplicity, discovered that these overlaps could be predicted, even manipulated with the right tools. The first wave were the pioneers, Grix added. They built the first stable crossings, mapped the nearest adjacent realities, and established the early frameworks that would eventually become the authority and other factions. I tried to process this. So they were, what? Interdimensional explorers? And colonizers and diplomats, and occasionally warriors. Grix poked at the obsidian fragments with a thin metal probe. They also created artifacts, tools to help navigate and manipulate the spaces between worlds. Chronoliths were among their most sophisticated creations. What does it do? I asked, eyeing the broken pieces warily. In its complete form? It's a key that can open doors that should stay closed. Grix's voice dropped to a rumble. The first wave discovered that some world lines end abruptly, temporal dead ends where reality itself collapses or transforms beyond recognition. They created chronoliths to seal these dangerous endpoints, preventing their instability from spreading to connected world lines. A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the restorative brew. And you? Broke one of these seals? I asked Nessa. She shook her head firmly. I didn't break it. This is just a fragment of a complete chronolith, probably a backup key or partial component. But even a fragment contains the resonance pattern of whatever endpoint it was designed to seal. Which makes it valuable, Grix added grimly. Or dangerous. Often both. To whom? I pressed. The collectors? The authority? That Mariel person? All of the above, potentially. Nessa gathered the fragments and wrapped them in a cloth Grix provided. The collectors want it because they want everything with historical significance. The authority would want it contained because unstable chronoliths could threaten multiple world lines. And Mariel? I prompted when she fell silent. Nessa's expression darkened. Special Division has its own agenda. If Mariel's involved personally, there's more happening than simple artifact recovery. Grix grunted in agreement. Special Division doesn't deploy assets like her for routine matters. Something had been bothering me since our confrontation in the street. She seemed to know you, Nessa. Not just professionally. A complicated expression crossed Nessa's face. We have history. We were in training together before she was recruited to Special Division. She was your friend? I guessed. She was my partner. The pain in Nessa's voice made it clear she meant more than just a professional relationship. Until ambition became more important than principles. An uncomfortable silence fell. Grix busied himself at one of his workbenches, giving us a moment of privacy. I'm sorry, I said eventually, unsure what else to offer. Nessa waved it away. Ancient history. The point is, she knows how I think, which makes her even more dangerous. Grix returned, carrying what looked like a modified surveyor's transit mounted on a tripod. Enough reminiscing. Let's see what we're really dealing with. He set the device on the floor and aimed its lens at the wrapped fragments. Standard spectral analysis first. Might tell us which endpoint this chronolith was keyed to. He twisted several dials on the device, and it hummed to life, projecting a beam of soft golden light onto the cloth bundle. The light refracted as it passed through the fragments, splitting into a rainbow that spread across the wall behind. Except this rainbow contained colors I had no names for, bands of light that seemed to shift and pulse as if alive. Grix studied the pattern, muttering to himself and occasionally making notes on a pad of yellow paper. After several minutes, he switched off the device with a sharp twist. Well, Nessa prompted. It's genuine first-wave craftsmanship, all right. He ran a hand through his tangled beard. But there's something odd about the resonance pattern. It doesn't match any documented endpoint in my reference library. Could it be from a previously unknown dead end? Nessa suggested. Possible. Or... He hesitated. Or what? I asked. Grix sighed heavily. Or it could be keyed to an artificial endpoint. A manufactured dead end, rather than a natural one. Nessa straightened, suddenly alert. You mean like a quarantine seal? Or a prison? That would explain Special Division's interest, Grix agreed. And why the collectors had it marked for disposal, rather than preservation. Some artifacts are too dangerous even for them to hoard. A distant boom rattled the workshop's many hanging tools and implements. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. That didn't sound good, I observed. Grix moved quickly to a contraption that resembled a periscope embedded in the wall. He peered through it, adjusting knobs as another, closer boom shook the room. Trace hounds, he confirmed grimly. And they've brought backup. Special Division Enforcement Squad, by the looks of it. How close? Nessa was already on her feet, gathering the chronolith fragments. Too close. They're sweeping this sector block by block. Must have narrowed down your transition signature. Grix abandoned the periscope and began grabbing items from various workbenches, stuffing them into a leather satchel. My outer wards will hold them off for maybe 10 minutes, but after that. He made a graphic throat-slitting gesture. We need to move, Nessa agreed. She turned to me. Eli, I'm sorry about all this. I never meant to drop you in the middle of a multiversal incident. Little late for apologies, Grix snorted, continuing to pack. Question is, what's the plan now? You can't outrun Special Division forever, especially not with an untrained border welder in tow. Another explosion, this one close enough to make the floor tremble. We need to know what this chronolith was sealing, Nessa said decisively. That's the key to understanding why everyone's so desperate to recover it. And how do you propose we do that? Grix demanded. The only complete records of first-wave endpoints are in the Authority archives, which you're currently locked out of, or the Collector's vault, which you've already robbed once. A thoughtful look crossed Nessa's face. Not the only records. Grix paused his frantic packing. Oh no. No. Tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. The Librarian might know, Nessa said, ignoring his dismay. The Librarian? I echoed. Sounds reasonable enough. Grix let out a bark of laughter, entirely devoid of humor. Shows what you know, border boy. The Librarian isn't some helpful bookkeeper. She's one of the most dangerous beings in the district. She's also fair, Nessa countered. And she respects the old protocols. If we formally request sanctuary and information, you'll be binding yourself to whatever price she names. Grix exploded. Have you forgotten what happened to Courier Jessic? All he did was ask for directions, and now he spends half the year cataloguing toxin spores in the deep archives. Another explosion, much closer. Dust and small fragments of ceiling rained down. We don't have time to debate this, Nessa insisted. The library is neutral ground. Even Special Division can't follow us there without violating ancient compacts. Assuming we make it there at all, Grix grumbled, but he resumed packing with renewed vigor. Fine. Your funeral, potentially literally. Maybe I should get a vote here? I suggested, raising my hand like a student in class. Both of them turned to look at me, seemingly surprised that I had an opinion. You're right, Nessa said after a moment. This isn't fair to you. If you want, Grix can guide you back to a transition point. You could return to your world. If he can make it there with Special Division hunting him, Grix qualified. And assuming they don't simply pick him up on the other side. That seeker has his scent now, remember? Thanks for the optimism, I muttered. I considered my options, such as they were. Return to a world where supernatural hunters were looking for me, or continue deeper into this bizarre reality with two people who, despite their bickering, at least seemed to know what they were doing. Not much of a choice, really. I'll stick with you, I told Nessa, at least until we figure this out. Besides, I doubt Lou's holding my job at the Gas and Go after I disappeared mid-shift. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Probably not. All right then. She turned back to Grix. What's our best route to the library from here? He shook his head in resignation. The old maintenance tunnels. They run under most of the district. Not comfortable, but they bypass the main transit points where enforcement will be watching. Tunnels it is. Nessa slung Grix's now bulging satchel over her shoulder. Lead the way. Grix moved to a corner of the workshop and pulled aside what I had assumed was a pile of scrap metal, revealing a circular hatch set into the floor. He twisted the handle and heaved it open, releasing a waft of stale air. Down you go, he instructed, producing a small lantern from somewhere in his voluminous coat and lighting it with a snap of his fingers. And watch the third rung, it's loose. I peered into the darkness below. A metal ladder descended into shadows that the lantern's light barely penetrated. Another boom, this one accompanied by the sound of splintering wood from somewhere above us. That's the outer door, Grix said tensely. Now would be a good time to hurry. I didn't need more encouragement. I swung onto the ladder and began to climb down, grateful that my years of indecision about a career path had at least included 6 months working construction. The ladder rungs were slick with condensation, and true to Grix's warning, the third one shifted alarmingly under my weight. About 15 feet down, my feet touched solid ground. I moved aside as Nessa descended after me, followed by Grix, who somehow managed to close and reseal the hatch above us before joining us in what appeared to be a brick-lined tunnel tall enough for me to stand upright, though Nessa had to duck slightly. Grix held the lantern aloft, revealing a passage that stretched into darkness in both directions. The walls glistened with moisture, and the floor was uneven but relatively clean. Maintenance tunnels, he explained in a hushed voice. Built during the district's early days to access the Foundation wards. Not many remember they exist anymore. Which way? Nessa asked. Grix pointed left. 500 yards that way, then we hit a junction. North Fork leads eventually to the library's lower levels. How long will it take us to reach it? I asked, already dreading the walk through the claustrophobic space. If we're lucky, about an hour, Grix replied, starting forward. If we're not lucky, he shrugged. Doesn't matter how long it would have taken, because we'll be dead or captured. Your optimism is truly inspiring, I muttered, falling into step behind him. Survival isn't about optimism, he shot back. It's about preparation and facing reality. Quiet, both of you, Nessa whispered from behind me. Sound carries down here. We moved in silence after that, our progress marked only by the soft splash of our footsteps in shallow puddles and the rhythmic creak of Grix's leather equipment. The air grew colder as we walked, and I found myself shivering despite the lingering warmth of the restorative brew in my system. After what felt like much longer than the promised 500 yards, we reached a T-junction where our tunnel intersected with a larger one. Grix held up a hand, signaling us to stop and extinguish the lantern. In the sudden darkness, I became aware of a faint blue glow emanating from the tunnel to our right. the same eerie light cast by the gas lamps in the district above. With it came the distant sound of voices. "Patrol," Grix breathed, barely audible. "Wait." We pressed ourselves against the damp brick wall as the voices grew louder. I strained to make out words, but they seemed to be speaking in a language I didn't recognize. All sibilant consonants and long vowels. The blue glow intensified, casting long shadows down the tunnel toward us. I held my breath as two figures passed the junction without turning. Humanoid shapes in what looked like sleek armor, carrying long staffs that emitted the blue light. They never glanced in our direction, continuing on their patrol route. We waited until both the light and voices had faded completely before Grix relit the lantern at its lowest setting. "Collector sentinels," he explained quietly. "Not looking for us specifically, just routine patrol. Still best avoided." "I thought you said few people knew about these tunnels," I whispered. "Few does not mean none," he replied testily. "The collectors have been in the district since its founding. They know all its secrets. Most of them, anyway," Nessa amended. "Come on, this way." She led us down the left fork of the junction, the tunnel gradually sloping downward. The brick walls gave way to rough-hewn stone, suggesting we had passed beyond the originally constructed passages into something more ancient. The air changed too, less damp, more dry and dusty, with an undertone of old paper and leather. Ahead, the darkness seemed different somehow, less dense, as if filled with possibilities rather than absence. "We're getting close to library territory," Nessa explained, noticing my curious glance. "You can feel the boundary even down here." "What exactly is this library?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "I'm guessing it's more than just books." "The library contains knowledge from across the multiverse," she replied. "Not just books, but artifacts, recordings, memories, experiences. Anything that can be preserved and catalogued. Its true size is unknown because it exists partially outside conventional spacetime." "And the librarian?" Grix answered before Nessa could. "Nobody knows exactly what she is. Some say she's first wave, others claim she's much older. All that matters is she enforces absolute neutrality within her domain and extracts payment for every piece of information accessed." "What kind of payment?" "Depends on what you ask for," Nessa said. "Small questions might cost a memory or a day of service. Bigger ones." She shrugged. "Let's just say we should be careful what we ask." The tunnel ended abruptly at a circular door made of dark wood banded with bronze. No handle, no lock, no obvious mechanism. Just a flat metal plate in the center etched with a simple symbol. An open book with a flame above it. Nessa approached the door and pressed her palm against the metal plate. "We seek knowledge and sanctuary," she stated formally. "3 travelers bound by circumstance, pursued by those who would break neutrality." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the metal plate began to glow with a soft amber light that spread outward along the bronze bands. The wood between the bands seemed to become translucent, revealing glimpses of endless shelves beyond. The door didn't so much open as dissolve, the wood and metal transforming into motes of golden light that swirled away like fireflies, leaving an arched opening in their place. "That's our invitation," Nessa said, stepping through without hesitation. Grix gestured for me to follow. "After you, border boy. And remember, touch nothing, promise nothing, accept nothing unless the librarian herself offers it." I nodded and crossed the threshold, feeling a momentary resistance like pushing through thick syrup, then a gentle pop as I emerged on the other side. We stood in what appeared to be an enormous reading room. The ceiling soared at least 50 feet above us, supported by slender columns of white marble. Bookshelves stretched in all directions, their tops disappearing into shadows the ambient lighting didn't reach. Tables of various sizes and designs were scattered throughout the space, some occupied by readers so absorbed in their studies, they didn't even glance up at our arrival. The readers themselves were as diverse as the inhabitants of the district streets. Humans or near-humans alongside creatures I couldn't begin to categorize. One table was occupied by what appeared to be a column of gently swirling mist contained within an elaborate brass framework, somehow turning pages with tendrils of vapor. "Welcome to the Great Library," Nessa murmured. "Stay close. It's easy to get lost here, sometimes literally sometimes. Otherwise." I didn't need to ask what she meant by otherwise. Something about this place suggested that losing oneself might have meanings beyond the physical. Grix had extinguished his lantern, unnecessary in the warm golden light that seemed to emanate from the very air of the library. He looked uncharacteristically nervous, his eyes darting between the shadowed aisles of books. "How do we find the librarian?" I asked. "We don't," Nessa replied. She finds us. As if summoned by her words, a soft voice spoke from behind me. Indeed I do, especially when uninvited guests arrive through my maintenance entrance. We walked for what seemed like minutes, but could have been longer. Time felt strangely elastic in this place. The architectural layout defied logic. We'd turn a corner into a section that should have overlapped with where we'd just been, yet somehow didn't. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of reading rooms populated by creatures that made me question my sanity, or shelves containing objects that couldn't possibly be books, including what appeared to be softly glowing orbs and crystalline structures that hummed faintly as we passed. Finally, we arrived at a circular chamber with a domed ceiling painted to resemble a night sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. In the center stood a round table of dark wood surrounded by 5 chairs. The only other furniture was a tall cabinet along one wall, its dozens of small drawers labeled in script I couldn't read. Please be seated, the librarian said, indicating the chairs. We complied, though I noticed Grix seemed reluctant to fully settle into his seat, perching on its edge as if prepared to flee at any moment. The librarian took the chair opposite Nessa, leaving one seat empty. Now then, she began, folding her hands on the table's polished surface. Let us speak plainly. You've stolen a powerful artifact with a complex history, and now the consequences of that action pursue you. I didn't know its significance when I took it, Nessa said. It was in a disposal container in the collector's receiving area. The librarian's expression sharpened. The collectors do not dispose of artifacts, particularly not first-wave chronoliths. If it was marked as such, the deception was deliberate. A plant, Grix suggested, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the library. Someone wanted Nessa to take it? Perhaps, the librarian conceded. Or perhaps it was meant for someone else, and our courier here was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, Nessa pressed, we need to know what it is, what endpoint it was designed to seal. The librarian leaned back in her chair, studying us with those unsettling amber eyes. Before I agree to help you, understand that this information falls under the category of restricted knowledge. The price will be commensurate with its value. What price? I asked, finding my voice at last. She turned those cat-like eyes to me. For you, Borderworlder, a memory, something formative, something that shaped who you are. A chill ran through me. You would take one of my memories? Not take. Copy. Her voice was gentler now. It would remain with you, but a perfect reproduction would be added to the library's collection. Memories are valuable archives, especially from perspectives the library lacks. And for us? Nessa asked. The librarian's gaze shifted back to her. For the courier who walks between worlds? Service. 3 tasks of my choosing, to be called upon at times of my determination. Nessa nodded, as if this was expected. And for the artificer? The librarian turned to Grix. Grix squirmed uncomfortably. I was just the guide. I'm not really part of this quest. Yet here you sit, she interrupted smoothly. In my reading room, seeking my knowledge. Nothing is free, Master Ironmaul. He sighed heavily. What's your price? A creation. Something new, born of your considerable talents. I shall specify the parameters when the time comes. Grix looked even more uncomfortable, but nodded reluctantly. Very well. The librarian rose and moved to the cabinet of drawers. Do all 3 of you accept these terms, freely and without reservation? Speak your acceptance clearly. I accept, Nessa said immediately. Grix hesitated, then grumbled. I accept. They both looked at me. I thought about what I was potentially giving up, some crucial memory that had shaped my identity. But then, what identity was I really protecting? The night shift convenience store clerk with no clear direction and few meaningful connections? I accept, I said finally. So witnessed, the librarian intoned. The air in the room seemed to thicken momentarily, as if the agreement itself had physical weight. She opened one of the small drawers and withdrew what appeared to be a crystal disc about the size of my palm, its surface etched with concentric circles. Returning to the table, she placed it in the center and rested her fingertips lightly on its edge. Place the fragments upon the disc, she instructed Nessa. Nessa carefully arranged the broken pieces of the chronolith on the crystal surface. As the last fragment touched the disc, the etchings began to glow with a soft blue light. The librarian closed her eyes, her fingertips still maintaining contact with the disc's edge. For several long moments, nothing seemed to happen. Then the fragments themselves began to emit a faint resonance, a nearly subsonic hum that I felt rather than heard. The constellations painted on the ceiling above us began to shift, stars realigning into new patterns that somehow seemed more deliberate, more meaningful. The librarian's eyes opened suddenly. The amber glow intensified, pupils contracted to thin black lines. "Interesting," she whispered. "Most unexpected. What is it?" Nessa asked tensely. The librarian removed her fingers from the disk, and the humming ceased. The constellations above returned to their original positions. "This chronolith was not created by the first wave," she stated, her voice grave. "It bears their techniques, their signature approach to transitionalism, but its origin predates their work by considerable time. Pre-first wave." Grix sounded genuinely shocked. "But that would make it primordial," the librarian confirmed. "From the antecedent period." Nessa paled visibly. "That's impossible. The antecedent is just a theory, a myth. Many myths contain truths, courier." The librarian gathered the fragments and rewrapped them carefully. "The multiverse holds secrets older than any of our current factions or philosophies. Before the first wave discovered the transitions, before the authority or the collectors or any known power, there were others who understood and manipulated the boundaries between worlds." "What was it sealing?" I asked, sensing this was the crucial question. The librarian's gaze fell on me with new interest. "Direct, aren't you?" The border worlder asks what his more experienced companions hesitate to voice. She handed the wrapped bundle back to Nessa. It was not sealing an endpoint, but rather a crossroads, a nexus where multiple world lines converge. According to the resonance pattern, this particular nexus was a confluence of 7 distinct realities. 7, Grix whispered, awe and fear mingling in his voice. No wonder the collectors had it marked for disposal. The power required to seal a 7-point convergence would be immense, the librarian agreed, and potentially catastrophic if disrupted improperly. "But I didn't disrupt it," Nessa protested. "I just took a fragment, and it was already broken." "Perhaps," the librarian conceded, though the timing of events suggests otherwise. "Tell me, courier, when exactly did your pursuit begin? Before or after you handled the artifact?" Nessa frowned, thinking. "After. Almost immediately after I examined it at a way station between the deep market and the border world." "And how did you examine it?" "Standard courier protocol, energy signature scan, origin verification, structural integrity assessment." She paused, her frown deepening. "The structural scan might have triggered a resonance response. The seal was already failing," the librarian concluded. "Your scan may have accelerated the process, but it was likely inevitable. The question now is why the collectors had such a dangerous artifact in their disposal area to begin with." "A trap," Grix suggested darkly. "Or a test. Or something far worse, a deliberate attempt to break the seal." The librarian's expression was solemn. "If the nexus this chronolith was designed to isolate becomes fully accessible again." She didn't finish the thought, but her silence spoke volumes. "What exactly is it, this nexus?" I asked. "What would happen if the seal breaks completely?" The librarian's cat-like eyes fixed on me. "That, border worlder, is a second question with its own price." Before I could respond, the air in the empty chair beside me seemed to thicken and distort. It coalesced rapidly into a humanoid form. A young woman in the sleek uniform of what I assumed was the Authority, the same organization Mariel belonged to. Unlike Mariel's predatory elegance, however, this woman had an air of harried urgency. "Librarian," she gasped, clearly out of breath despite having materialized rather than run into the room. "Forgive the intrusion, but diplomatic protocol has been breached. Special Division forces are at the south entrance demanding access to pursue fugitives. They claim exception under Statute 17 of the Interdiction Accords." The librarian's face hardened, all trace of academic curiosity replaced by cold anger. "They dare invoke the interdiction against my sovereignty? On what grounds?" "Multiversal security threat of the highest order," the messenger replied. "They've brought a verification official to authenticate their claim." "So it begins," the librarian murmured, almost to herself. She rose gracefully. "Inform the entrance wardens that I will attend shortly. No one is to be admitted until I arrive, diplomatic status notwithstanding." The messenger nodded and disappeared as suddenly as she had arrived, the air shimmering briefly where she had sat. "It seems our time grows short," the librarian told us. "Special Division is invoking emergency powers that even I cannot deny indefinitely, not without risking open conflict between the library and the Authority." "What do we do?" Nessa asked, clutching the wrapped fragments. The librarian moved to the cabinet again and opened a different drawer. From it, she withdrew a small object that she concealed in her palm. I have fulfilled the terms of our agreement by identifying the artifact's nature and purpose, she said formally. Your debts to the library remain and will be collected in due course. However, a hint of conspiracy entered her voice. I find myself curious about the outcome of this particular mystery, and the library's neutrality compels me to treat all factions equally, including those not officially recognized. She approached me and pressed the object into my hand. A small bronze key, warm to the touch, its head shaped like an open book. The service passage you used to enter has many branches, she said, pitching her voice low. The westward fork eventually emerges in the old quarter, a part of the district even Special Division hesitates to enter. A colleague of mine maintains an establishment there, the Tarnished Cup. Show the proprietor this key, and you will find. Let us call it scholarly assistance. I closed my fingers around the key, which seemed to pulse once against my palm as if alive. Why me? I whispered. Why not give this to Nessa or Grix? The librarian's eyes glinted. Because you alone have no existing allegiances in this conflict, Borderworlder. You alone might look at the whole picture without factional bias. She stepped back. Now I must attend to our unwelcome visitors. That should give you approximately 7 minutes to find your way back to the service tunnels. Thank you, Nessa said, already standing. The librarian fixed her with those unsettling eyes. Do not thank me yet, courier. I have simply provided an opportunity, not salvation. The path ahead remains treacherous. She gestured to a previously unnoticed door behind us. That will lead you back to the maintenance level. Chapter 5. The maintenance tunnel door slammed shut behind us, sealing out the sounds of the library's impending diplomatic crisis. The bronze key burned in my grip, its book-shaped head glowing faintly. Move, Grix barked, shoving me forward. The librarian's distractions won't last long. We ran, the tunnel's shadows stretching like grasping hands. Nessa led the way, her injured palm leaving faint traces of blood on the walls, a breadcrumb trail for anyone following. But the key's warmth spread through me, steady and reassuring. At the first junction, I hesitated. Westward fork, I muttered, recalling the librarian's words. The tunnel branched left into deeper darkness, and right toward a distant hum of energy. Left, I said, gripping the key tighter. Trust me. Nessa raised an eyebrow, but followed without question. Grix grumbled about borderworld intuition, but his footsteps quickened. The tunnel twisted, narrowing until we had to walk single file. The air thickened with the scent of burnt metal and something older, like dust from a tomb. After what felt like miles, a sliver of light appeared ahead, a rusted iron door, slightly ajar. Beyond it lay the old quarter. The district's orderly chaos had dissolved into a labyrinth of crumbling stone buildings, their facades overgrown with vines that pulsed faintly with bioluminescent veins. The streets were empty except for shadows that moved with purpose, avoiding the pools of light cast by flickering gas lamps. The Tarnished Cup, Nessa breathed, spotting a weathered sign hanging crookedly above a door. The image of a chipped teacup glowed faintly, its cracks filled with gold. Inside, the air smelled of aged paper and cinnamon. The walls were lined with shelves holding mismatched teacups, each etched with symbols that matched the ones on Nessa's chronolith fragments. Behind the counter stood a figure cloaked in patchwork robes, their face hidden beneath a hood. You're late, they rasped, voice like wind through a keyhole. The librarian said you might come. Before we could speak, the door burst open. Mariel strode in, flanked by 2 Special Division enforcers in matte black armor. Her violet flame danced in her palm, illuminating the room in eerie shadows. End of the line, courier, she said, eyes locked on Nessa. Hand over the artifact, and the boy walks free. Nessa stepped forward, but I grabbed her arm. No, this is my choice. I turned to the cloaked figure. The librarian sent us. We need to fix what's broken. The figure tilted their head. To mend the nexus, you must become the seal. Mariel laughed. Poetic nonsense. Kill them. The enforcers raised their weapons, but the cloaked figure slammed a gnarled staff on the floor. The teacups on the shelves began to vibrate, their symbols glowing white-hot. Time to choose, Eli Marsh, the figure hissed. Stay here, and your old life dies. Walk through the cup, and you become something more. I looked at Nessa, her face a mix of fear and resolve. The key in my hand pulsed, resonating with the chronolith fragments. I choose the district, I said. The cloaked figure nodded. Then drink. They poured a cup of liquid starlight. I drank, and the world dissolved. Epilogue. The Nexus stabilized. The Authority never found the chronolith. It had been reforged into something new, bound to a human heart. Nessa stayed in the district, her partnership with Mariel severed, but her duty unbroken. Grix grumbled about unpaid debts, but crafted me a new key, this one shaped like a crescent moon. As for me, I tend the cup now, serving tea to wanderers between worlds. Some say I'm the Librarian's eyes in the old quarter. Others whisper I'm the Nexus itself, given form. But on quiet nights, when the gas lamps flicker just right, I still see lose gas and go out of the corner of my eye. A shadow of the life I left behind. And I smile. The district's secrets are mine now. And its doors? They're never truly closed.